The scent of brewing coffee and old books hung in the air of their small, one-bedroom apartment, a fragrance Sarah had come to associate with home. It was a space defined by love rather than luxury, a cozy testament to 5 years of shared dreams and careful budgeting. Sunlight streamed through the single large window in the living room, illuminating dust motes, dancing over a worn but comfortable sofa and shelves, overflowing with Michael's architecture textbooks and Sarah's classic novels. This was their world, a tightly woven tapestry of affection and aspiration. And for the most part, it was a new... But lately, a new thread had been introduced. One shimmering with a golden, almost terrifying, promise. Sarah swirled the last of her coffee in her mug, her gaze distant. The grief was still a palpable thing, a heavy cloak she hadn't yet learned to shed. It had only been 6 months since the accident that had stolen her parents. A sudden, brutal severing that left her feeling The inheritance they left behind felt less like a windfall, and more like the final, weighty chapter of their love story. It was substantial, the result of a lifetime of prudent work and smart investments, and it was meant to be her future, her and Michael's future. Still thinking about it, Michael's voice was soft as he came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He smelled of soap and the faint, woody scent of his aftershave. Followed gaze to the real estate magazine lying open on their small dining table. On the page was a picture of a charming 2-story house with a wraparound porch and a yard big enough for a garden and maybe, one day, a dog. "It's just Allah," Sarah murmured, leaning back into his embrace. "It feels wrong to be planning with it. Like I'm profiting from them." "Hey," he said, turning her around to face him. His eyes, the color of warm honey, were filled with a gentle understanding that had been her anchor for months. "Your parents wanted this for you. They wanted you to be safe, to be secure, to build a life. This isn't profiting. It's honoring their wishes. We're going to build a home, Sarah. A real home. A place to fill with memories. For them." He was right, of course. The money was their final gift, a tool to build the foundation they could no longer provide in person. The house wasn't just wood and nails, it was security, a place to put down roots, a future free from the anxiety of rent increases and cramped city living. It was their golden ticket, and the anticipation was a nervous flutter in her chest, a fragile hope blooming in the barren landscape of her grief. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a series of sharp, decisive knocks on the door. Michael sighed softly. "She's early." Eleanor, Michael's mother, never just arrived. She made an entrance. When Sarah opened the door, she was met with a smile that was perfectly manicured but didn't quite reach the woman's piercing blue eyes. Eleanor swept into the room, a whirlwind of expensive perfume and crisp linen, a large casserole dish held aloft like a trophy. "I brought my famous lasagna," she announced, her voice a little too loud for their small apartment. "You two are probably living on takeout, with all the stress you've been under." She set the dish down on the counter, her eyes doing a swift, comprehensive sweep of the room. It was a look Sarah had become familiar with, a quick inventory that seemed to calculate the value of every object and find it wanting. "Thanks, Ma," Michael said, giving her a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. "You didn't have to." "Nonsense, darling. That's what family is for. To take care of each other." Her gaze landed on Sarah, and her smile soft, becoming a mask of maternal concern. "And how are you, dear? Truly, this whole inheritance business must be so overwhelming for you." There it was, the topic that was never far from Eleanor's lips, always couched in sympathy, yet feeling strangely like an interrogation. "I'm managing," Sarah said, forcing a small smile of her own. Eleanor patted her arm, her touch cool and dry. "Of course you are. You're a strong girl. But finance, and lawyers, and all that, it can be a minefield for the inexperienced. All those vultures trying to get a piece of your pie." She glanced around the apartment again, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "It's a tremendous responsibility, a life-changing amount of money. You'll want to make sure it's handled properly." To secure your future. Michael's future. The subtle emphasis on her son's name did not go unnoticed. To Eleanor, this wasn't just Sarah's legacy. It was the financial security she had always craved for her son, now finally within reach. She saw Michael's modest life with Sarah not as a romantic starting point, but as a failure she was eager to correct. "We have a good lawyer, Eleanor," Sarah said, a defensive edge to her tone she couldn't suppressed. "He's handling the probate process." "Oh, I'm sure he's perfectly competent, dear," Eleanor said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "But lawyers are just part of the equation. It's the investments, the accounts, the strategy. That's where people get into trouble. I've managed our family's finances for 30 years. I've seen it all." She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "I just want to make sure you're protected, that you both are." Later that evening, long after Eleanor had left, leaving behind the lingering scent of her perfume and a half-eaten lasagna, Sarah voiced the unease that had settled in her stomach. "She's so intense about the money, Michael." Michael was at his drafting table, sketching lines that would one day become someone else's dream home. He didn't look up. "She's a mom. She worries. She's always been obsessed with financial security. Ever since my dad's business went under when I was a kid. She just wants to make sure we don't make any mistakes." "It feels like more than that," Sarah pressed gently. "It feels like she doesn't trust me with it, with my own parents' money." He finally set down his pencil and turned to her, his expression softening. He crossed the room and pulled her into a hug. "She loves you, Sarah. She's just a bulldozer. She sees a problem and wants to drive right through it. She thinks she's helping. Don't read too much into it. We're a team. You and me. We'll figure this out together." Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that Eleanor's probing questions and unsolicited advice were born of genuine concern. But as she stood there, wrapped in her husband's arms, she couldn't shake the feeling of a cold shadow creeping over their golden dream. It was the shadow of a woman who smiled with her lips, but not her eyes. A woman who spoke of help, but seemed to crave control. And in the quiet heart of her grief, a small, new fear began to take root. Taylor's office was a world of hushed tones, polished mahogany, and the faint, papery scent of old money. For Sarah, it was an alien landscape. Seated beside Michael in a plush leather chair that seemed to swallow her whole, she felt like a child playing dress-up in an adult's world. The man across the desk, Mr. Abernathy, was kind but spoke a language of fiduciary duties, estate taxes, and probate administration that made her head spin. Stacks of documents, dense with legalese, were piled neatly before them, representing the final, bureaucratic chapter of her parents' lives. Every signature she scrawled felt like a betrayal, reducing her vibrant, loving parents to a series of asset transfers and legal clauses. The emotional weight of it all was suffocating, and it was in this fog of grief and confusion that Eleanor made her move, positioning herself not as an intruder, but as a lighthouse in a storm. She had insisted on attending the second meeting with Mr. Abernathy under the guise of providing moral support. She sat slightly behind Sarah, a silent, observant presence, until Mr. Abernathy began discussing the logistics of transferring investment portfolios and liquid assets. Then she leaned forward. "If I may, Mr. Abernathy," she began, her tone a perfect blend of deference and authority. "Sarah is, as you can imagine, completely overwhelmed. This is a difficult time. I have some experience in managing portfolios. Perhaps, to simplify things, we could consolidate some of these assets into a new, more manageable account. Something I could help Sarah oversee, just until she's back on her feet." Mr. Abernathy glanced at Sarah, his expression neutral. "That is certainly an option, Mrs. Davenport. If Sarah wishes to grant you power of attorney or list you as a co-signer on an account, we can draw up the necessary paperwork." Sarah's heart clenched. It felt like a monumental step, a ceding of control she wasn't prepared for. I don't know," she stammered, looking at Michael for support. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. His mother's confidence was a powerful force, and he, too, seemed to believe it was for the best. Later that week, Eleanor invited Sarah for lunch. Just the two of them. She chose an upscale bistro where the clinking of cutlery on porcelain was the loudest sound. It was a strategic choice, a place of calm civility where emotional outbursts were unthinkable. Over salads they barely touched, Eleanor laid out her case with the precision of a seasoned general. "I know you're hesitant, dear," she started, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "And I understand. You're a very independent young woman. Your parents raised you to be. But this isn't about independence. It's about prudence. Think of me as a guide, a financial guardian angel, if you will." She reached across the table and placed her cool hand over Sarah's. "The world of high finance is treacherous. There are advisors who will push you into high-risk funds that benefit them more than you. There are market fluctuations you can't predict. I simply want to create a safe harbor for the bulk of the funds, a joint account, one we can both see. It offers transparency and a second set of eyes. My eyes, which have been watching the market for 30 years. It's just to get things started. Once you feel more comfortable, more knowledgeable, you can take the reins completely. This is about protecting your parents' legacy, Sarah. For you, for Michael, for your future children." Every word was carefully chosen, a tapestry woven from threads of logic, love, and subtle emotional manipulation. She made Sarah's inexperience feel like a dangerous liability, and her own involvement feel like an act of selfless maternal protection. The desire for family harmony, a desperate wish to please the only maternal figure she had left, warred with the small, screaming voice of her intuition. Michael, bless his trusting heart, saw no danger. "It makes sense, honey," he'd said when she recounted the conversation. "We don't know the first thing about this stuff. Having her help manage the main account for a while takes the pressure off. It lets us focus on finding a house, and you focus on Healy." And so, reluctantly, Sarah agreed. The next meeting wasn't at the lawyer's office, but at a bank branch Eleanor had chosen. The air was thick with the scent of sterile money and corporate efficiency. Eleanor was in her element, speaking fluently with the bank manager, directing the flow of conversation, pointing to where Sarah needed to sign. There were so many papers, filled with clauses and subclauses, Sarah's eyes glazed over. Eleanor would patiently explain, "This just allows me to transfer the funds from the estate account," or "This one lets me speak to the investment broker on your behalf, to save you the trouble." The final document was for the joint high-yield savings account, the safe harbor. As Sarah picked up the heavy, chain-link pen, she hesitated. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. She could feel Eleanor Segase on air, patient but insistent. She thought of Michael's trusting face, of his belief in his mother's good intentions. She thought of the overwhelming stacks of paperwork and the crushing weight of her grief. Taking a breath, she told herself it was the right thing to do, the sensible thing. It was a temporary measure to keep the family peace. She pressed the pen to the paper. The scratch of the nib was a small, sharp sound in the quiet room. With each letter of her name, she felt she was signing away more than just authority. It felt like she was handing over the keys to her future, the legacy of her parents, the very dream they were all supposed to be building together. As she pushed the document across the desk, Eleanor gave her a brilliant smile. This time, it reached her eyes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. At the time, Sarah misinterpreted it as relief, the satisfaction of a mother who has successfully secured her children's future. She would only understand much later that it was the look of a predator who had just watched its prey walk willingly into a perfectly set trap. The initial weeks after the accounts were settled were deceptively calm. Eleanor was the picture of efficiency, providing verbal updates that were both reassuring and infuriatingly vague. "Everything is progressing nicely." "Yeah?" she'd say over the phone. "The market had a slight dip, but I've positioned us well. Don't you worry about a thing." It was a soothing lullaby of financial jargon that Sarah, at first, allowed to wash over her. The relief of not having to manage the complexity herself was immense, and she and Michael threw themselves into the joyful distraction of house hunting. But as weeks bled into months, the tune of Eleanor's lullaby began to change. The updates became less frequent. When Sarah would ask for a specific number or a printed statement, Eleanor would artfully deflect. "Oh, it's all tied up in a term deposit right now. Getting a wonderful interest rate. It's better not to look too often. Makes one anxious." Another time, she'd laugh it off. "Sarah, darling, you sound so worried." "Trust me, I'm handling it. Let's talk about something more pleasant, like the caterer for Michael's birthday party." Each evasion was a tiny splinter under Sarah's skin. The initial sense of relief curdled into a low-grade hum of anxiety. Around the same time, she began to notice subtle shifts in Eleanor's lifestyle. It started small. A new designer handbag, the kind Sarah knew cost more than their monthly rent, was dismissed with, "I found the most incredible deal at an outlet store." You wouldn't believe it. Then came the weekend trip to a luxurious spa resort. Eleanor posted photos on social media, all smiles, in a plush white robe, a glass of champagne in hand. The caption read, "A little well-deserved." When Sarah asked Michael about it, he shrugged. "Dad's pension, maybe?" She's always been good at finding bargains. The bargains became more frequent and more extravagant. A complete re-landscaping of her front yard, new, expensive-looking art on her living room walls. The final, blaring alarm bell was the car. Eleanor pulled up to their apartment one Sunday in a brand-new luxury sedan, the metallic paint gleaming in the sun. "My old car was becoming a money pit," she announced cheerfully, "and the dealership was having a massive end-of-year sale." It was practically a steal. That night, Sarah couldn't hold it in any longer. The image of that car was burned into her mind. She sat on the edge of their bed, her arms wrapped around herself, as Michael got ready for sleep. "Michael, we need to talk about your mother," she said, her voice tight. He sighed, pulling his t-shirt over his head. "What about her? The car, the trips, the new handbag. Where is she getting the money for all of this? Every time ask her for a statement, for any kind of real update on the inheritance, she changes the subject. Don't you find that strange?" Michael's face hardened, a defensive wall slamming down. "Here we go again. Sarah, my mother is a frugal woman. She's saved her whole life. Maybe she decided to finally enjoy some of it. What's wrong with that? What's wrong is that it started right after she took control of my money." Sarah's voice rose, frustration and fear making it sharp. "It's a huge coincidence. Don't you think? She won't show me any proof of what's happening with my inheritance, and suddenly she's living like a millionaire. It doesn't feel right. My intuition is screaming at me that something is wrong." "Your intuition," Michael shot back, his tone laced with disbelief. "Or your paranoia. You've been suspicious of her from day one. You're looking for problems where there aren't any. This is my mother we're talking about. She raised me. She loves us. The idea that she would do something dishonest. It's insane. It's insulting. Is it?" Sarah stood up, her heart pounding. "Or is it more insane to hand over a life-changing amount of money to someone and then not be allowed to see what they're doing with it?" "I'm not accusing her of anything, Michael. I'm just asking for transparency, for a piece of paper that proves everything is okay." "Why is that so much to ask? Why can't she just show me?" The argument escalated, a storm that had been brewing for months finally breaking. It was their worst fight ever, filled with hurt and accusation. For Michael, it was an attack on the integrity of the woman who had raised him. For Sarah, it was a desperate plea to be heard, to have her valid fears acknowledged. He accused her of being ungrateful and distrustful. She accused him of being blind and naive. They went to sleep that night in stony silence, a cold chasm between them in their small bed. Michael saw his wife's fear as an indictment of his family. Sarah felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her husband, her partner, the one person she should have been able to count on, had dismissed her concerns and sided with his mother. The whispers of doubt in her mind had become a deafening roar. She lay awake long after Michael's breathing had evened out into sleep, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. The knot of dread in her stomach was no longer just a feeling. It was a certainty. Something was terribly wrong, and if she wanted to find out what it was, she would have to do it by herself. The decision to investigate her own mother-in-law felt like a profound betrayal, a clandestine act that stained the very fabric of her marriage. But Michael's refusal to listen, his blind faith in Eleanor, had left Sarah with no other choice. Her suspicion had become a living entity, a ravenous creature that gnawed at her peace of mind. And so she began to search for the truth in the quiet, lonely hours after midnight, when the city was asleep and the only light in their apartment was the cold, blue glow of her laptop screen. Her first break came from a place of mundane domesticity. Eleanor had come over for dinner a week prior, and in her usual whirlwind of activity, she had left a leather portfolio on the entryway table. She'd called later, telling Sarah not to worry, she'd pick it up next time. Curiosity, now sharpened into a weapon, got the better of Sarah. Late one night, with her heart hammering against her ribs, she unzipped the portfolio. Inside were various bills and correspondence. Tucked into a side pocket was a bank statement for an account Sarah didn't recognize. It was in Eleanor's name alone. The statement was only for the previous month, but two things made Sarah's blood run cold. First, the opening balance was zero. Second, there was a single, massive deposit 2 days later for an amount that was eerily close to a quarter of her total inheritance. A notation next to it read, "Investment capital transfer." Sarah's hands trembled as she took a photo of the document with her phone. This wasn't a joint account. This wasn't safekeeping. This was something else entirely. This was a secret. Her second discovery was digital. Years ago, she had helped Eleanor set up an email account to share family photos. Eleanor, not being tech-savvy, had used a simple, memorable password and, as far as Sarah knew, had never changed it. It felt like a despicable invasion of privacy, but the image of that bank statement burned behind her eyes, fueling her resolve. She typed in the email address and the password, holding her breath. It worked. She started in the trash folder, guessing Eleanor would be careless enough to delete incriminating evidence without permanently erasing it. She was right. After scrolling through dozens of junk mail messages, she found it, a chain of emails between Eleanor and a man named Marcus Thorne, a financial advisor Sarah had never heard of. The emails discussed a high-risk, speculative real estate venture in another state. In the final message, Eleanor had written, "Proceed with the full wire transfer as discussed. The funds are cleared and ready. This is the opportunity of a lifetime, and I intend to seize it." The date on the email was just 3 days after Sarah had signed the papers at the bank. There was no mention of Sarah, no hint that this was a joint decision. It was written with the unmistakable authority of a sole investor. Sarah felt sick. She read the email again and again, the words blurring through a haze of disbelief. The safe harbor Eleanor had promised was a lie. While she had been lulling Sarah with vague platitudes about term deposits and market dips, she had been gambling her inheritance on a risky venture, all for her own personal gain. Each discovery was like pulling at a loose thread on a sweater. With every tug, the entire garment threatened to unravel, revealing the ugly, naked truth beneath. The final thread presented itself during a strained family brunch, an event Michael had insisted on to try and smooth things over. Sarah played the part of the dutiful daughter-in-law, her smile feeling like a cheap plastic mask. During the meal, Eleanor's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and her expression tightened before she quickly excused herself, stepping out onto the patio to take the call. Thinking she was out of earshot, Eleanor's voice carried through the slightly ajar sliding glass door. Her tone was sharp, stripped of its usual syrupy sweetness. "Listen to me," she hissed into the phone. "The closing needs to happen by the 30th. No exceptions. I don't care what you have to do. The funds are liquid and ready to be moved. No, my son and his wife know nothing about this, and they won't. This is my business, my property. Is that understood?" Sarah froze, a forkful of food halfway to her mouth. Asterisk, my property. Asterisk, the words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of her mind. She looked across the table at Michael, who was happily chatting with his father, oblivious. In that moment, the last vestiges of doubt evaporated, replaced by a chilling, horrifying certainty. This wasn't mismanagement. This wasn't a series of poor but well-intentioned decisions. This was a calculated, systematic theft. Eleanor wasn't just helping herself to a small piece of the pie. She was stealing the entire thing, right from under their noses. Sarah excused herself from the table, her legs feeling unsteady. She locked herself in the bathroom and stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger, hair face pale, her eyes wide with a terror that was quickly being consumed by a cold, rising fury. The whispers of doubt were gone. The unraveling thread had led her to the end. Now, all that was left was to find the one irrefutable piece of proof that would force everyone, especially Michael, to see the monster she had let into their lives. The drive to the main branch of the bank felt surreal, as if she were watching a movie of someone else's life. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and cheerful songs played on the radio, a stark, almost cruel contrast to the icy dread coiling in Sarah's stomach. She had the documents from her initial meeting with Mr. Abernathy, the ones outlining the estate accounts before Eleanor's help. She also had the grainy photos of Eleanor's secret bank statement on her phone, and the overheard words asterisk, my property asterisk, playing in her mind like a broken record. Had told Michael she was going to visit a friend, a lie that tasted like ash in her mouth. But she needed to do this alone. She needed to see the truth with her own eyes, unclouded by his potential disbelief or his need to defend his mother. This was her legacy, her fight, and she had to face it head-on. Inside the bank, the marble floors and hushed, professional atmosphere did little to calm her frayed nerves. She was directed to a small, glass-walled office to meet with a senior account manager named Mrs. Gable, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Sarah took a deep, shaky breath and laid out her story, trying to keep her voice even. She explained that she was the beneficiary of an estate, that her mother-in-law had been helping her manage the funds, and that she now had some concerns and simply wanted a complete, consolidated statement of all accounts she was party to. Mrs. Gable listened patiently, tapping quietly at her keyboard. Of course, Ms. Collins. Let me just pull up your file. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft clicking of the keys. Sarah's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched the manager's face, searching for any flicker of emotion. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a small frown creased Mrs. Gable's brow. She clicked a few more times, her movements becoming slower, more deliberate. Finally, she looked up, her kind eyes now filled with a carefully neutral expression that Sarah recognized as professional pity. Ms. Collins, Sarah, according to our records, the main estate account, the one established by your parents' executor, was closed 8 weeks ago. Closed. Sarah's voice was a faint whisper. What do you mean? Closed. Where did the money go? The balance was transferred out, Mrs. Gable said, choosing her words with care. The funds were moved through a series of transfers to several different investment vehicles and external accounts. She paused, then added gently, the transfers were all authorized. Authorized by who? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. The authorization forms were signed by you, granting Eleanor Davenport full power of attorney over the disposition of these specific assets, and the final transfers were initiated by her, as was her legal right under that authority. Power of attorney. The words hit her like a physical blow. She remembered the flurry of papers Eleanor had pushed in front of her that day at the bank. Ones. Eleanor had breezily explained away as routine. This one just lets me speak to the broker, she had said. Sarah had signed it without reading the fine print, drowning in grief and trusting the woman who was supposed to be her family. And the joint account? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The one we opened together. The safe harbor. Mrs. Gable's expression softened with genuine sympathy. She turned her monitor slightly so Sarah could see. That account was opened, and a large initial deposit was made from the estate. However, she pointed to a transaction list on the screen. The funds were systematically withdrawn over the following month. The final withdrawal, which closed the account, was made 6 weeks ago. The account no longer exists. Sarah stared at the screen. It was all there, in black and white. Date, transaction numbers, and balances that dwindled from a life-changing fortune down to a single, stark number: 0. Every penny, every last cent of the legacy her parents had worked their entire lives to build for her was gone. It wasn't just money. It was the house with the wraparound porch. It was the chance to go back to school. It was the security of knowing they could handle a medical emergency. It was the garden she wanted to plant in her mother's memory. It was the future. Eleanor hadn't just stolen her inheritance. She had stolen her dreams, her security, her past, and her future. All with a series of signatures on documents Sarah had been too naive and grief-stricken to understand. The initial shock was a wave of cold numbness that washed over her, silencing the world. The bank manager's voice became a distant buzz. Then the numbness receded, and in its place came a pain so profound it was physical, a sharp, tearing sensation in her chest, as if her heart were being ripped in too. Betrayal. It was a word she thought she understood, but she hadn't. Not like this. This was a betrayal that poisoned memories, that desecrated the very idea of family. She managed to thank Mrs. Gable, her voice sounding hollow and distant to her own ears. She walked out of the bank and into the blindingly bright sunshine. She made it to her car before her legs gave out. She collapsed into the driver's seat, the dam of her composure finally breaking. A raw, guttural sob tore from her throat, a sound of pure agony. She wept for her parents, for their stolen gift. She wept for Michael, for the terrible truth she would have to inflict upon him. And she wept for her own foolish, misplaced trust. The tears streamed down her face, hot and furious, but they did nothing to wash away the cold, hard certainty that had settled in her soul. Her life, as she knew it, was over, and a new one forged in the fires of this devastating loss, was just beginning. Sarah drove not to her own modest apartment, but directly to Eleanor's. The tidy suburban streets and perfectly manicured lawns of her mother-in-law's neighborhood seemed to mock her. Picture of the very stability that had just been stolen. She parked her car at the curb, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The grief that had consumed her in the car had now crystallized into something harder, sharper, a cold, righteous fury. She didn't knock. She used the spare key. Eleanor had insisted she keep for emergencies, a gesture that now felt like a sick joke. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She found Eleanor in the newly renovated kitchen, a testament to Sarah's stolen legacy. Gleaming quartz countertops had replaced the old laminate, and state-of-the-art stainless steel appliances hummed quietly. Eleanor was arranging flowers in a vase, humming a cheerful tune. She looked up, her smile faltering slightly at the sight of Sarah's thunderous expression. "Sarah, dear, what a surprise. I didn't know you were stopping by." "I just came from the bank," Sarah said, her voice low and chillingly calm. She walked further into the room, her eyes taking in the expensive fixtures, the custom cabinetry. "This is a beautiful kitchen, Eleanor. You have wonderful taste. I'm curious, though, how did you afford it?" Eleanor's smile vanished completely, replaced by a guarded, wary look. She set the flowers down. "We've been saving for years. You know that your father-in-law and I have always been careful." "Careful?" Sarah repeated, the word dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you call it?" She took a step closer, her body vibrating with suppressed rage. "The estate account is empty, Eleanor. The joint account is closed. It's all gone, every single dollar." For a moment, Eleanor feigned ignorance, her eyes wide with manufactured shock. "What? That's impossible. There must be some mistake at the bank. A clerical error. Stop it. Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. Just stop lying. I know you took it. I saw the transfers. I know about the power of attorney. I was too stupid and too grief-stricken to read properly. You planned this from the very beginning, didn't you? All that talk about helping me, about protecting me, it was all a lie. The mask of maternal concern finally fell away, crumbling to reveal the cold, hard avarice beneath. Eleanor's posture straightened, her expression shifting from false concern to defiant indignation. I did what was necessary, she said, her voice turning sharp and defensive. Necessary for what? To buy yourself a new car, a new kitchen, to secure this family's future, Eleanor shot back, her voice rising. My son's future. You have no idea how to handle money. You and Michael, with your little dreams of a cottage with a garden, you would have squandered it in a few years, wasted it on sentiment and foolishness. I saw what your parents built, and I refused to let you throw it away. It wasn't yours to see. It wasn't yours to secure, Sarah screamed, the sound tearing from her raw throat. It was a gift from my parents. To me, you had no right. Had every right. Eleanor's face was twisted in a self-righteous sneer. I am Michael's mother. I've spent my life worrying about his stability. A stability you couldn't provide in that tiny apartment. That money was his chance, and I took it for him. Primera invested Italiano properly, in ventures that will provide real, lasting wealth. You should be thanking me. The sheer audacity of the statement stole Sarah's breath. She stared at the woman before her, a complete stranger. This was not the charming, if overbearing, mother-in-law she knew. This was a thief, gloating over her prize. It was at that moment that the back door opened, and Michael walked in, a grocery bag in his hand and a smile on his face. Mom, I brought that coffee you like. His smile faded as he took in the scene. His mother and his wife, squared off like mortal enemies, the air in the room thick with a toxic, palpable hatred. What's going on? He asked, his gaze shifting between the two women. Michael, thank God, Eleanor said, rushing to his side and adopting the tone of a victim. Your wife is having some sort of breakdown. She's accusing me of the most horrible things. She stole it, Michael, Sarah said, her voice breaking with the agony of it all. She stole everything. My entire inheritance. It's all gone. Michael looked at his mother, his face a canvas of confusion. Mom, what is she talking about? This is a misunderstanding, right? Eleanor looked at her son, and for a fleeting second, Sarah saw a flicker of regret, quickly extinguished by her unshakable self-justification. I did it for you, Dorin, she said softly, clutching his arm. For us. She doesn't understand business. I moved the money to protect it, to make it grow. Michael pulled his arm away as if he'd been Bernard, the truth dawning in his horrified eyes. Moved it where, Mom? Where is the money? It's invested, Eleanor said defensively, in a real estate development. A wonderful opportunity. In your name, Sarah. Pressed, her voice deadly quiet. Eleanor hesitated. The legal structure was complex. For tax purposes, it was simpler to have me as the sole proprietor. And there it was, the confession. Michael staggered back, his face ash. He looked from his mother's defiant face to his wife's tear-streaked, devastated one. The world he had built, the fundamental belief in his mother's goodness that had been the bedrock of his life, crumbled into dust. He had defended her. He had dismissed Sarah's fears. He had called her paranoid. And all along, she had been right. How could you? He whispered, his voice choked with a grief that rivaled Sarah's. How could you do this to her? To us? I did it for you, Eleanor insisted, her voice cracking. No, Michael said, shaking his head slowly, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. You did this for you. He walked over to Sarah, his movements stiff and robotic, and wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she began to sob uncontrollably. Held her tightly, his own body trembling with shock and betrayal. standing in the middle of a kitchen paid for with stolen dreams. Their home, their marriage, and their family was utterly and irrevocably shattered. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur of numb disbelief and hollowed-out pain. The vibrant tapestry of Sarah and Michael's life together had been and they were left trying to stitch together the scraps. Michael was a ghost in their small apartment, consumed by a toxic cocktail of guilt for not believing Sarah and a profound, disorienting grief for the mother he thought he knew. He made one final, heartbreaking phone call to Eleanor, a conversation Sarah only heard in muffled, agonized snippets from the other room, ending with Michael's choked final words. I can't talk to you again." He hung up the phone and severed the tie, an act of loyalty to Sarah that was also an act of profound self-mutilation. Clinging to a desperate sliver of hope, they pooled what little savings they had and made an appointment with a new lawyer, a litigator named Ms. Davies, who specialized in financial fraud. Her office was modern and stark, a world away from the clubby mahogany of Mr. Abernathy's. There was no false comfort here, only cold, hard reality of the law. Sarah recounted the entire sordid tale, her voice flat and devoid of the emotion she no longer had the energy to expend. Michael sat beside her, silent and grim, occasionally adding a detail or correcting a date. He laid out the few pieces of evidence they had: the photo of Eleanor's secret bank statement, the timeline of her lavish purchases, the story of the overheard phone call. They presented their story as a clear-cut case of theft, a simple, brutal violation they expected the law to correct. Ms. Davies listened intently, her expression impassive, taking meticulous notes. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. "This is a deeply unfortunate and distressing situation," she began, her tone measured and empathetic, but carrying an undercurrent of grim pragmatism. "However, from a legal standpoint, it is incredibly complex." She picked up a pen and pointed to a line in her notes. "The central issue here is the power of attorney document. You say you signed it, Sarah?" "Yes," Sarah admitted, shame heating her cheeks. "But I didn't understand what it was. She misled me. She told me it was just to let her talk to the brokers." "I have no doubt that she did," Ms. Davies said. "That's what's known as fraud in the inducement. The problem is proving it. In the eyes of the bank and the law, your signature is your consent. It gave her broad authority to act as your agent. She was legally empowered to move those funds. But she moved them into her own accounts," Michael interjected, his voice raw with frustration. "She stole it for herself. That has to be illegal." "It is, Senora." Davies agreed. "It's a breach of fiduciary duty and likely constitutes criminal fraud and theft by conversion. The challenge isn't in identifying the crime. It's in proving the criminal intent to a legal standard." Eleanor's defense, and I can tell you right now, this is what it would be, is that she was not stealing, but merely managing the funds on your behalf. She will claim her speculative real estate venture was a legitimate, if risky, investment strategy intended for your ultimate benefit. She will argue that the funds being in her name was a necessary legal maneuver for the deal. It becomes a case of, he said, she said. Her word against yours. Ms. Davies let that sink in before continuing. She was clever. By moving the money through a series of transfers, creating shell accounts, and investing in an out-of-state LLC, she created a deliberately convoluted paper trail. Unraveling it would require extensive financial forensics. We would need to subpoena her bank records, her investment statements, her emails. She would fight us at every turn, filing motions to delay and dismiss. This type of litigation can drag on for years. Sarah felt the last bit of hope shriveling inside her. "So, what you're saying is, she can just get away with it?" "I'm not saying that," the lawyer said gently. "I'm saying the path to justice through the civil court is long, arduous, and astronomically expensive. The legal fees for a case like this could easily run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, with absolutely no guarantee of a win. And even if you win a judgment against her, Collecting on it is another battle entirely. She could declare bankruptcy or move her assets to places we can't touch. They sat in stunned silence, the crushing weight of reality settling upon them. The law, the great system of justice they had believed would be their champion, was not a sword of righteousness, but a complex, unwieldy machine, one that ran on money, the very thing they know. Longer addiv. We could report it to the district attorney, Ms. Davies offered, though her tone lacked conviction. But frankly, they are overwhelmed with cases. A familial financial dispute, even one of this magnitude, is often seen as a civil matter. They might not have the resources or the inclination to pursue a criminal investigation without a smoking gun. They left the lawyer's office an hour later, stepping out into the gray afternoon. The world seemed to have lost its color. De path tu. Legal recourse was a dead end, a locked door, for which they didn't have the golden key of wealth. They were powerless. Eleanor had not only stolen their money and their future, but she had also insulated herself behind a fortress of legal technicalities and loopholes. She had known exactly what she was doing. That night, back in their cramped apartment that now felt more like a cage than a home, Sarah hit the bottom. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a profound, empty despair. She curled up on the sofa, staring blankly at the wall. The dream of the house with the wraparound porch now just a cruel, ghostly image in her mind. The system had failed them. Justice was a commodity they couldn't afford. Eleanor had won. Despair was a thick, gray fog that filled every corner of their apartment and every moment of Sarah Essa waking life. For weeks, she moved through the world like a ghost, haunted by what she had lost. The grief for her parents was now intertwined with the acute pain of betrayal, creating a sorrow so deep it felt bottomless. Michael tried to reach her, his own guilt and anger a constant, simmering presence between them, but she was adrift on a sea of apathy. The fire that had fueled her confrontation with Eleanor had been extinguished, leaving behind only cold, damp ash. She quit her job at the bookstore, unable to face the forced pleasantries with customers. She stopped looking at real estate magazines. The future she had so carefully mapped out had been erased, and she had no idea how to draw a new one. Eleanor, they heard through the grapevine of Michael's estranged family, was thriving. She was traveling, hosting parties, and carrying on as if nothing had happened, insulated by her stolen wealth and her unshakable self-righteousness. Every imagined scene of Eleanor's triumphant life was another twist of the knife for Sarah. Rock bottom came on a Tuesday morning. While aimlessly scrolling through the local news website, a headline caught her eye. There was a picture of Eleanor, smiling elegantly, shaking hands with the mayor. The article was about the annual fundraiser for the city's most prestigious arts foundation, a pillar of the local high society. Eleanor was a new, prominent member of the gala's organizing committee, and the article quoted her extensively, praising her generous philanthropic spirit and her commitment to enriching the community. Reading the words, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The fog of despair began to burn away, not gently, but in a sudden, violent conflagration. The hypocrisy was so staggering, so profoundly obscene, that it acted like a defibrillator on her dormant heart. This woman, a thief who had stolen a legacy from a grieving daughter, was being publicly lauded as a saint. She wasn't just content with the money. She was using it to purchase a new, more lustrous identity for herself. Eleanor Davenport, the benevolent matriarch and community patron. In that moment, Sarah understood. The lawyer, Ms. Davies, had been right about the legal dead ends, but she had missed the point entirely. Sarah had been trying to fight Eleanor in an arena where money was the only weapon. But Eleanor's greatest vulnerability wasn't her bank account. It was her ego. It was her desperate, insatiable need for admiration and social status. She didn't just want to be rich. She wanted to be seen as important, respected, and adored. Her public image was the foundation upon which her entire sense of self was built, and a foundation Sarah knew could be shattered. That night, for the first time in months, Michael saw a flicker of the old Sarah return. The vacant, haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, focused glint he hadn't seen since before her parents died. She was at her laptop, not aimlessly scrolling, but typing with a fierce, quiet intensity. "What are you doing?" he asked softly, almost afraid to break the spell. "Research," she said, not looking up. Don. Being a victim, Michael. The law can't give me justice. So I'm going to have to create my own. The seed of retribution had been planted. Over the next few weeks, it grew into a meticulously crafted plan. Sarah transformed. She channeled all her grief, all her rage, into a singular, cold, calculated purpose. She became a student of Eleanor's life. She followed the Arts Foundation on social media, studying the names and faces of the board members and major donors Eleanor's new social circle. She read back issues of local society magazines, learning who was important, who was influential, and who was a rival. She discovered that Eleanor's primary ambition was to secure a coveted seat on the foundation's board of directors. The position was unpaid, but it was the ultimate symbol of social arrival in their city. To get it, she needed to impress the current board, particularly its formidable chairwoman, a notoriously sharp old-money philanthropist named Beatrice. Sarah also delved into Eleanor's weakness, her greed. She knew her mother-in-law saw herself as a brilliant, undiscovered financial genius. The real estate deal she had used the inheritance for was, Sarah found through public records, a legitimate but highly leveraged venture. Eleanor had won, but she would be hungry for another victory to prove her prowess. She was arrogant, she was avaricious, and she was utterly predictable. Sarah's plan began to take shape, not as a blunt instrument of revenge, but as a delicate, intricate trap. It would not be illegal. It would not involve threats or violence. It would be a piece of social and financial theater. And Eleanor would be its unwitting star. The stage would be the Foundation's annual Art of Giving Gala, the very event Eleanor was helping to organize. It was the apex of the social calendar, the one night where all the people whose respect Eleanor craved would be in one room. Sarah used a small, final emergency fund her parents had left her in a separate account, a few $1,000s she had guarded fiercely to set her plan in motion. It wasn't about getting the money back. That was gone forever. This was about something more valuable. It was about taking from Eleanor the one thing she couldn't bear to lose: her precious, painstakingly constructed reputation. Sarah was no longer just a grieving daughter. She was an architect of justice, and she was about to design Eleanor's downfall. The Art of Giving Gala was the glittering jewel of the city's social calendar, held in the grand marble atrium of the Municipal Art Museum. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light over hundreds of guests in tuxedos and evening gowns, their laughter echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. At the center of it all was Eleanor Davenport, radiating a triumphant glow. Dressed in a deep emerald gown that had cost a small fortune, she moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a woman who believed she had finally arrived. She was a co-chair of the event, and her ambition to secure a board seat was the evening's worst-kept secret. Across the room, unseen and unnoticed, Sarah watched. She was not a guest. She was dressed in the simple black uniform of the catering staff, a temporary server hired for the night. An expensive wig hid her familiar hair, and subtle makeup altered her features just enough to render her anonymous. Seeing Eleanor, so confident and celebrated, sent a jolt of cold fury through her, but she pushed it down, channeling it into focus. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The play was about to begin. Phase 1 of her plan had been initiated 2 weeks prior. Using her seed money, she had hired a graphic designer to create a prospectus for a fictional, ultra-exclusive art investment fund called the Medici Group. It was a masterpiece of deception, filled with convincing jargon, forged testimonials from European art collectors, and details of a revolutionary algorithm for predicting auction prices. The centerpiece was an offering for a newly discovered painting by a minor but respected 19th century artist, a painting that didn't actually exist. The prospectus promised an astronomical, short-term return on investment, but was open only to a select few. through a carefully cultivated acquaintance in the disgruntled former assistant of one of the board members whom Sarah had found. Befriended online, she had leaked the prospectus into Eleanor's orbit. As predicted, Eleanor, insatiable greed and her desire to impress her new peers, were the perfect bait. She had taken it, hook, line, and sinker. Phase 2 was now in motion. Sarah had anonymously tipped off a prominent local arts blogger, a man known for his sharp pen and his disdain for the nouveau rich, about a major, exclusive investment announcement happening at the gala. He was now circulating, a shark-smelling blood in the water. Sarah's role was simple: to observe and to deliver the final, critical piece of puzzle. She moved through the crowd, refilling champagne glasses, ears open. It wasn't long before she heard Eleanor's voice, holding court near a large sculpture. She was speaking with Beatrice Wexler, the powerful board chairwoman, and 2 other influential donors. One has to be so forward-thinking in today's market, Eleanor was saying, her tone dripping with self-importance. The stock market is for the timid. The real opportunities, the truly life-changing ones, are off-market. One just needs the right connections and the courage to act decisively. Beatrice Wexler, a woman who could spot pretense from a mile away, raised a skeptical eyebrow. Is that so, Eleanor? Absolutely, Eleanor said, puffing up with pride. This was her moment. In fact, I've just secured a position in an incredible new art fund, the Medici Group. They're managing the sale of the recently unearthed Seraphine's Lament. The returns are projected to be, well, simply staggering. It was by invitation. Only, of course. She had walked directly into the center of the trap. Sarah took a deep breath. It was time. Her final move was the most audacious. She had created a small, elegant card. On one side was the logo for the Medici Group. On the other, a QR code. She approached Eleanor's group, her face a mask of professional deference. "Excuse me, Mrs. Davenport," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "A message was left for you at the check-in desk." Eleanor, momentarily annoyed at the interruption, took the card. Her eyes lit up when she saw the logo. She assumed it was a private confirmation from the fund, a mark of her elite status. "Thank you," she said dismissively, waving Sarah away. "What's that, Eleanor?" one of the donors asked, his curiosity piqued. "Oh, just a little business," Eleanor said with a smug smile. To Beatrice, she added, "As I was saying, it takes a keen eye to spot these things." She pulled out her phone, intending to discreetly view the message. But the arts blogger, alerted by Sarah's prearranged signal to the catering manager, suddenly appeared at her elbow. "Eleanor Davenport, I hear you have a major scoop for my readers tonight," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of those nearby. Flustered but pleased by the attention, Eleanor saw her chance to cement her reputation in front of Beatrice. "Well, I wouldn't call it a scoop," she said, feigning modesty. "Just a smart investment. The Medici Group. You can look it up." She held up her phone and scanned the QR code, expecting it to lead to a private investor portal she could boast about. The QR code did not link to an investor portal. It linked to a web page Sarah had spent a week building. As Eleanor's phone's screen loaded, the large projector screen behind the main stage, which had been displaying a slideshow of museum art, suddenly flickered. It now mirrored the web page on Eleanor's phone. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. On D's screen, in massive letters, was the title: The Sarah Collins Foundation for Victims of Elder and Estate Fraud. Below the title was a single, large photo of Eleanor, the one from the newspaper where she was shaking the mayor's hand, and beneath that, a block of text: Our foundation is made possible by the involuntary founding donation of Eleanor Davenport, who, in a demonstration of profound greed, attempted to invest stolen inheritance funds into a fictional art group. The painting she sought, Seraphine's Lament, does not exist. The Medici Group does not exist, but the need for justice does. Every dollar Mrs. Davenport wired to our offshore account this morning will now be used to provide legal aid to those like Sarah Collins who have been betrayed by the ones they trusted most. Time seemed to stop. Every eye in the room was on Eleanor. The color drained from her face, replaced by a ghastly, mottled white. The smug smile was frozen in a silent scream. She stared at the screen, then at her phone, then back at the screen. The reality of the situation crashing down on her with the force of a physical blow. She had been publicly, spectacularly, and utterly humiliated. She hadn't just been exposed as a fool. She had been exposed as a thief. Her own greed, her own arrogance, had been the weapon used against her. From the shadows, Sarah watched her mother-in-law's world burn to the ground. The implosion was immediate and catastrophic. The silence in the grand atrium was broken by a cacophony of frantic whispers that spread through the crowd like wildfire. Phones were raised, capturing Eleanor's face, frozen in a mask of horror and disbelief. The arts blogger was already furiously typing on his device, his expression one of pure journalistic ecstasy. Beatrice Wexler, the board chairwoman, took one long, withering look at Eleanor, a look that conveyed a lifetime of social condemnation before turning on her heel and walking away. Without a word. It was a public execution, and Eleanor's social standing was the casualty. She stumbled away from the screen, pushing through the sea of staring, judging faces, and fled the museum. But there was nowhere to hide. The next morning, the blogger's story was the talk of the town. It was a deliciously scandalous tale of hubris and downfall, and the city's elite devoured it. The story didn't explicitly detail the family theft. Sarah had been careful to frame it as an investment scheme to avoid legal complications, but the implication was clear and devastating. Eleanor wasn't just a gullible investor. She was a fraud, publicly funding a foundation for victims of the very type of crime she had committed. Her carefully constructed world crumbled with breathtaking speed. The Arts Foundation issued a terse statement announcing Eleanor Davenport had resigned from the gala committee, effective immediately. Invitations to luncheons and charity events stopped arriving. Fair, Pony, calls to her new, wealthy friends went unanswered. She became a pariah. A cautionary tale whispered over cocktails and canap. The reputation she had so desperately coveted, the one she had stolen an inheritance to build, was not just broken. It was annihilated, replaced by a permanent stain of ridicule and shame. Sarah watched it all from a distance, from the quiet of her small apartment. She felt no glee, no triumphant joy. The victory was hollowed by the sadness of what had been lost. There was only a grim, weary satisfaction. The feeling of a terrible weight being lifted. She hadn't gotten her parents' money back, but she had reclaimed something far more valuable. The truth, she had taken back her power, not by sinking to Eleanor's level, but by using Eleanor's own character flaws as the engine of her destruction. Michael grappled with the news in his own way. He read the articles with a somber expression, his feelings a tangled knot of sorrow for the mother he once loved, and a quiet affirmation of his wife's strength. A week after the gala, he received a single, rambling letter from Eleanor, postmarked from a town 2 states away. It was filled with self-pity, blaming Sarah for ruining her life and never once acknowledging her own crime. Michael read it, folded it neatly, and threw it in the trash. It was the closure he needed. He looked at Sarah, his eyes clear for the first time in months. "She'll never get it," he said, his voice heavy with a final, sad acceptance. Acceptance. "She'll never understand what she did." "I know," Sarah said softly. "But we do," he continued, reaching for her hand. "And we're still here." In the end, the stolen legacy was gone. A ghost of a future that would never be. The grand house, with the wraparound porch, remained a picture in a magazine. But as Sarah and Michael sat in their cozy, cramped apartment, the sunlight streaming through the window, they realized they had survived. The storm had passed, and their small home, once a symbol of their deferred dreams, now felt like a fortress. Their foundation wasn't built on money or property. It was forged in betrayal and rebuilt with resilience, loyalty, and a hard-won truth. They would have to start over. Their path would be harder. Their dreams would take longer to achieve, but they would build their future on their own terms, with their own hands, free from the shadows of deceit. The money could be stolen, Sarah now knew, and reputations could be shattered. But ter, caro, dignity, their love, and the strength they had found in each other that was their true inheritance, a treasure no one could ever take away. For months after the gala, the autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. It swept through the open window of their small apartment, a cleansing breeze that seemed to carry away the last vestiges of the summer's suffocating heat and the lingering stench of betrayal. Sarah stood by that window, nursing a warm mug of coffee, watching the sunlight paint the city in hues of gold and amber. The frantic, desperate energy that had consumed her for months had finally dissipated, leaving behind a profound and unfamiliar calm. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was peace. A quiet, sturdy peace that had been earned in fire. The apartment, once a symbol of their constrained beginnings and then a cage of their despair, had become a sanctuary again. The worn sofa was no longer a place of sleepless, tear-filled nights, but a spot where she and Michael would curl up together, reading in comfortable silence. The overflowing bookshelves no longer felt like clutter, but a testament to the simple passions that had first brought them together. Life had settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by grand inherited dreams, but by small, deliberate acts of rebuilding. Michael was different. The shadow of his mother's betrayal had changed him, carving new lines of maturity around his warm, honey-colored eyes. The naive, almost boyish trust he had once placed in the world was gone, replaced by a more discerning wisdom. But the loss had been balanced by a gain. His guilt over not believing Sarah had transformed into a fierce, unwavering devotion. He saw her now not just as the woman he loved, but as a warrior who had fought a dragon on their behalf. He poured his renewed energy into his work, his architectural drawings taking on a new character. They were less about grand, impressive structures and more about intimate, functional spaces. He was no longer designing buildings. He was designing homes, with a deep and personal understanding of what that word truly meant. Sarah had found her own path forward. The idea of returning to the quiet, gentle world of the bookstore felt impossible, like trying to fit back into a dress she had long outgrown. The woman who had meticulously planned Eleanor's downfall could not go back to simply recommending novels. Instead, driven by a need to transform her trauma into purpose, she had started volunteering 2 days a week at a legal aid clinic downtown. She wasn't a lawyer, but she was a masterful organizer, a compassionate listener. She sat with people whose stories echoed her own tales of predatory family members, confusing legal documents, and the helpless feeling of being outmaneuvered by a system they didn't understand. She helped them sort their paperwork, made them coffee, and simply listened, offering the validation she herself had been so desperately denied. It was draining work, but it was meaningful. It was her way of honoring her parents' memory, not by living off their money, but by embodying their values of kindness and integrity. The final thread of their ordeal lay in a bank account under a newly formed corporate name. The money Eleanor had wired to the fictional Medici group, a sum that was substantial enough to be a painful lure, but was only a fraction of the total stolen inheritance, had been successfully transferred by Sarah before the account could be frozen. For weeks, it sat there, a tainted treasure they didn't know how to touch. One evening, as they were clearing away their dinner dishes, Michael broke the silence that had surrounded the topic. "We should use it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "A down payment on a small place. A real start. After everything we deserve, Sarah." Sarah paused, a plate in her hand. A few months ago, she would have agreed without hesitation. But the woman she was now saw it differently. "No," she said softly, turning to face him. "It's not our money. Not really. Using it for ourselves. It would feel like we were just the last ones to touch it in a long line of thieves." She saw the confusion in his eyes and continued. "That night, at the Gala Ondi screen, I created a fiction, the Sarah Collins Foundation for Victims of Elder and Estate Fraud. It was just a name, a weapon to humiliate her. But what if we made it real?" Michael stared at her, the idea slowly dawning on him. "Real how? We can't afford to run a whole foundation." "Not a big one," she explained, her voice gaining a quiet excitement. "But we could use that money to fund a program, a partnership with the clinic where I volunteer. We could hire a paralegal, just part-time, to help people review documents like the ones I signed. We could create a resource, a first line of defense for people who can't afford a lawyer like Ms. Davies. We could turn the ugliest thing that ever happened to us into a shield for someone else. The last of the confusion in Michael's face melted away, replaced by a look of profound admiration and love. He closed the distance between them and took the plate from her hands, setting it on the counter. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "You're incredible," he whispered. "That's it. That's the right thing to do. That's a legacy your parents would be proud of." And so, the weapon of their revenge was reforged into a tool of hope. Closure on Eleanor arrived unexpectedly, in a plain white envelope, with a postmark from a dreary, industrial town in another state. It had been forwarded from Michael's father's address. It wasn't from Eleanor, but from a distant cousin who had heard about the public scandal and, after several months, had worked up the nerve to write. The letter was awkward and full of condolences, but one paragraph stood out. "Astereski heard about your mother, and I'm so sorry, Michael. Frank Sau Ir. A few weeks ago at a grocery store out here, she's renting a small apartment by the highway. He said she looked old. All that money she came into from her investment is gone, tied up in legal fees and the failed property deal, which apparently collapsed when her partners pulled out after the news broke. She's alone. She told Frank she was the victim of a cruel conspiracy. I don't think she'll ever accept what she did." Asterisk. Michael read the paragraph aloud to Sarah. There was no triumph in his voice, only a deep, resonant sadness for the mother he had lost long before she was truly gone. She was isolated, disgraced, and penniless, having achieved the exact opposite of the security she had ruined their lives to obtain. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, with air self-delusion. As the only guard, he folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. A final chapter closed. That evening, the first real chill of winter was in the air. Sarah and Michael sat together on the sofa. Wrapped in a shared blanket, the real estate magazines had long since been recycled. In their place, resting on the coffee table, was one of Michael's sketchbooks. He opened it to a page he had been working on. It was a drawing of a small, simple cottage, no bigger than their apartment, but with clever windows to let in the light and a small porch with 2 chairs. Beside the house was a patch of earth labeled Sarah's Garden. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't a golden ticket. It was a dream, whittled down to its essential, most important parts: light, shelter, a place to grow things, and room for 2. It was a dream they could build themselves, with their own hands. Over time, Sarah traced the lines of the porch with her finger. She thought of her parents and the immense, life-changing gift they had tried to give her. Eleanor had stolen the money, but she had failed to steal the real inheritance. The true legacy wasn't the number in a bank account, it was the love that had taught. Her loyalty, the strength that had given her the courage to fight, and the resilience that had allowed her to stand here now, whole and at peace, in the quiet warmth of her own home. The path ahead was not the one she had expected, but it was theirs, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like enough.